it's a real pleasure to have Carmen Diana Deere here as a speaker. I'm really happy to have her here because Carmen was one of my most favorable class students in ARE. She was an outstanding person when she was there. And she was really unique from the beginning because most of us came to the PhD program and we really didn't know what we wanted to do. Most of us basically were quantitative. Most of us were basically learning on the go. And Carmen, from the beginning, was a person with a mission and a vision. And she really knew from the beginning what she wanted to do. And it took me many years to really to digest what she has done, which is really outstanding. Basically, when in 1974, there was no awareness. People spoke about feminism, like there were a lot of some books, and I don't know, Betty Friedan wrote something, but it wasn't a discipline. Latin American study was a hobby. All these things didn't really occur, and Carmen really was one of the people that really pushed it forward. I remember that when I was a third or fourth year student, and I went once to hear a lecture that she gave as a lecture. There were 500 students, and it was a lecture that I called in feminism from Eve to Jane Fonda. And in about, she really was so good in explaining the situation, the discrimination between genders, and the importance of gender inequality, and how it's an economic problem, and how it's a problem that is really should be part of our agenda. And I said, man, I'm doing all this mathematics and all this incredible modeling, but I could never think about something like this. It was really incredible. And over the years, you can really see that he had a career that made a huge difference. I think today, Latin American studies is a discipline, gender studies is a discipline. A lot of the issues that she raised were very important. Her approach to research, where she would really go to the field and collect data that really show the situation of women in different countries, both in terms of relationship, ownership of property right, legal rights, etc., really raised awareness and really caused a lot of change. So she had a fantastic academic career. If you look at the resume and the publication, the citation, it's great. But I think it's more than that. She really made a difference. And if you look at what is the MDP is all about, is making a difference. And I'm really pleased that we have someone here that made a huge difference. And she was a great friend of ours and an alumni of ARE. So we're really pleased to have Carmen. Thanks.
Let's see if the mic is working that I'm wearing. Okay, then I don't have to be stuck with that. Okay, well, it's wonderful to be here. I really do appreciate the invitation and that very kind introduction, David. And perhaps it's embarrassing to say that I'm still asking the same questions that I was asking when I came to Berkeley, over 40 years ago. And that's basically, who are the farmers, the tillers, the managers, the ones making the agricultural decisions, who are the landowners, and how is land acquired? Because even though we now have better data than we did in the 1970s, for Latin America, it's still pretty lousy data. When you compare Latin America with Africa and some parts of Asia, we really don't have good answers to these questions on a regional level. And these are the questions that we need to be asking not just across regions, which is a bit of what I'm going to focus on today, but also at the country level and in terms of our own field sites when we arrive and we're working in the field of agriculture or rural development. Well, today I'm going to walk you through these questions in terms of what we now know, and I'm going to throw out some propositions or hypotheses that perhaps aren't confirmed, but the one thing that happens after 40-some years of asking the same questions is that your intuition gets pretty good. Right? So you feel a little bit more secure about laying out what you think is happening based on a few points of data. As David mentioned, I did have a mission when I came to Berkeley, which was to make women visible. And back then, already in the 70s, what I had observed in my field work before coming to graduate school in Bolivia and in Brazil was that I thought a process of feminization of agriculture was starting to take place. Even at that point in time in the 70s, that women, particularly in peasant agriculture, seemed to be taking on more of the work, particularly in regions such as where I had been, where men migrated seasonally or were away for part of the year. But in the 70s, we had very few agricultural censuses that were even asking the sex of the farmers. In the case of Latin America, it was so taken for granted that only men were farmers and women at most were the helpers, that the census questionnaires did not have the category or the variable sex, right? So one of the accomplishments, to look first on the positive side, over what's happened over this period, is that now we do have at least an observation for 16 different Latin American countries, not including the Caribbean, because I'm going to focus on South and Central America and Mexico today in my talk. So if we look at the most recent censuses, and these are all since 2000, what you can see is an incredible variation, right? From Guatemala, where it's under 10% of the main farmers are women, to Colombia, Peru, and Chile, where we're talking about at least 30%. Well, part of the problem, and here the lousy data isn't just for Latin America, it's for every region of the world, is that the agricultural censuses have always focused on one landholder or one main farmer per agricultural unit. So by focusing on only one person being reported as the main farmer, whenever you had the situation of a couple being joint managers, and both involved in agriculture, it was always the household head. That, in fact, conformed to the civil codes of Latin America, where until the reforms of the 80s, some cases the 90s, the husband was the official head of household, the one that was responsible for household representation and management. So, even though now we have broader coverage of Latin America in terms of the main agriculturalists, we're still underestimating the participation of women in agriculture. But there has been a change. Finally, the FAO, after years and years of lobbying by feminists, introduced the concept of joint holders. So for the 2010 census round, for the first time, they suggested or recommended to countries that they consider leaving 2 spaces in the questionnaire so that more than one person could be reported as the landholder. Well, if you look at this array of 16 countries, only 2, Colombia and Brazil, followed that recommendation. So actually, the data here aren't exactly comparable because for Colombia and Brazil, we have a much better measure, that includes all of those peasant households, where both the main or the principal adults are the joint landholders or farmers. And that partly explains why Colombia leads the pack, right? Because once you take into account joint holders, there's a lot of units, close to 20%, that are reported as being where husband and wife are both farmers. So you end up with a larger share of the total number of farmers being women. This also increases the share in Brazil, but not to the point where it's leading the pack. So I needed to point that out in the case of Colombia, because people might be surprised to hear that Colombia would have the highest share of women farmers. Okay, well, what about the feminization thesis? At this point in time, we only have data for 8 different countries where we have 2 points that we can compare change, from the 2000 round of censuses and then the 2010 round. And of those countries, 5 countries show substantial change. Argentina, there the change is only 2.5%, or 2.5 points between those 2 census periods. The other countries that I didn't include here because I couldn't fit them all in the slide are Uruguay and Guatemala. They show increases less than 2%, so it's hard to argue based on this data that a feminization process is occurring. But it is suggestive of very different countries where the share of women that are principal farmers, and here for Brazil, I'm measuring only the principal farmers to show that increase. So the question then, well, first, the implications of this is that even if women's participation as a principal farmer is undernumerated for the reasons that I mentioned, we do see a growing visibility of women, and this is particularly on small farms where female landholders tend to be concentrated. I wasn't able to work with the data for all of these censuses to show you that clearly, but for many countries, it's over 50% of the farmers, or the principal farmers, are women once we go to farms that are under 10 hectares or under 5 hectares, depending on the size. Okay, well, turning to the factors that might explain this trend, first, one of the things that we know about Latin America, both urban and rural areas, is that the share of female household heads, du jour, is increasing at a more rapid rate in urban areas than rural areas. But that increase in rural areas would certainly explain part of that increase between the 2 census periods. Another aspect is that the share of de facto female heads is increasing related to temporary male migration. That phenomena really depends on the intersection of local, regional, national, and now international labor markets, when it shows up as an important factor or not. And thirdly, we've got changes going on in the gender division of labor in rural areas, where women are taking on the responsibility for household food security. So I'll be illustrating some of these points. For 2 of these censuses, we have data on the civil or the marital status of the principal farmers, as well as some additional questions that help us shed light on some of these issues. Here in the case of Chile in 2007, 46% of the women would not be considered household heads because they're married or in a consensual union. The heads that we always assumed represented the majority of women that would be captured by the census category, where only one farmer is reported, would most likely be women that are single, divorced, separated, or widows. So having 46% of these women in a partnership is what really opens up the space for thinking about the changes that might be taking place within rural households. Well, happily, the census asked the additional question only of partnered women, whether they were living with a partner and what their partner was doing. Interestingly enough, the great majority, 83%, were living with a partner. So that means that relatively few were de facto heads. So it isn't temporary migration that's explaining why they're showing up as the main farmer in the agricultural census. Even more interesting is the activity of the resident husbands. 25% don't participate on the farm. Presumably they're employed on off-farm activities of some sort. 45% say they're only participating occasionally, but 30% say they usually participate. Well, this indeed is novel, right? That the woman is declaring herself as the agriculturalist, but at the same time, the woman is saying, oh yeah, my husband always works in agriculture. So something unusual or different, at least from the past, is going on. That points immediately to the question, well, maybe they're joint holders. If the census had space for two people to be reported, we might have gotten a much more accurate picture in terms of what's actually going on, particularly on these family farms. But another possible question that we have to ask is, well, maybe the women that are partnered and whose husbands work in agriculture are reporting themselves as the main farmer because they're the landowner. And if they're the landowner, maybe that gives them more bargaining power and self-confidence. So when the census taker comes by and asks, who's the main farmer? They feel that they can answer, yes, that's me. Another possibility is that we're seeing a real change in the gender division of labor and control, right? That either because of because of the need to engage in multiple income-generating activities, a process that we've been following for many years, or because of different opportunities by gender for men and women, we might be getting this change in the gender division of labor. I'll be saying more about that later on. The other census where we can explore this a bit is in the case of Peru. There's a higher share of women that are de jure female heads with no partner, but we still have a sizable group, 42%, that are partnered women. Here, the additional question that was asked, and both men and women were asked the same question. In the Chilean census, they only asked the women about the activities of the man. They didn't ask the question in the other direction. But what was interesting here is that they asked if their spouse participated in agricultural activities. And as you can see, the positive responses were about equal for men and women. The overwhelming majority of men and women said, yes, my spouse engages in agriculture as well. So this is fairly good evidence that in family agriculture, in fact, the family participates. That women and men are both involved, engaged in farm labor, management, and decision-making. So it really is totally inappropriate to ask about a single person, as if a farm is managed always by only one person. Took us a long time to convince the FAO of this, but they finally got the message. Okay, well, let's turn then to who the landowners are. And here we're in a weaker position. First, the agricultural censuses do not ask who the landowner is. They have a very general land tenure question, asking if the farm or the agricultural unit is owner-operated as opposed to being rented or sharecropped, etc. But we can't assume that the landholder, the person that's reported as the main agriculturalist, is always the landowner, because the landowner could be the wife, the husband, both of them together, or one of them with someone else that may or may not live within the household. That means that the only data we have has to come from household surveys, and very few of these ask the ownership question at the individual level and at the parcel level. Because what we really need to understand is who owns each plot of land. Because each plot could be first under a different form of tenancy, and if inherited by men and women, different plots could be inherited by different people within the household. Around 2005 or so, on a project for the World Bank, we went through all of the LSMS-type surveys for Latin America. There was about 167 at that point in time. And we only found 11 questionnaires that asked about the ownership of any assets at all. The house, the business, land, etc. And only 5 of them asked about the ownership of land at this individual disaggregated level. As you're going to see, even these few questionnaires aren't very compatible due to the way that they ask the land ownership question. Some ask the question of who are the owners, irrespective of whether they have property documents. But the majority tend to only ask about who the owner is in relationship to a land title. And if you consider the share of landholders that don't have title in Latin America, it's still pretty high, 20 to 30% depending on the country, even though we've had decades of land titling programs. So that's a problem in terms of comparative analysis. So here I'm showing the data for Mexico and Paraguay that are the leaders, showing that around 30% of the land parcels at that point in time were owned by women. Mexico took into account joint land holdings in that survey. That was the Living Standard Measurement Survey. Paraguay did not take into account joint ownership, but did allow for different parcels to be reported, or their ownership to be reported. You can see much lower share in the case of Honduras and Nicaragua. The sad thing is that 10 years later, with my co-authors, we went back and looked at these same surveys to see if they had asked the question again in one of the more recent surveys. And none of these 4 countries had again collected data, disaggregated data on the sex of the owner. And even sadder was to find out that only 1 country had started asking in a sex disaggregated way at the parcel level who was the owner, El Salvador, that we've added here. But they only allowed 1 owner per farm. So that has all of the problems that we've seen or that I discussed in terms of the landholding. Given these problems, I I had this, for years I'd been thinking that it was time that I finally designed my own ideal questionnaire and did my own survey. So I was involved in the late 2000s in a comparative project with researchers from Ghana and the state of Karnataka in India, and two colleagues in the US, all feminist economists, in what we've called the Gender Asset Gap Project. And in Ghana and Ecuador, we were able to do national level surveys on asset ownership with represented surveys. So they were both rural and urban, where we collected for every single asset, down to the chickens and the cuis, ownership data on whether the asset was individually owned, who that person was, male or female, or if it was jointly owned. And we took great care to really disaggregate joint property, because we were really interested in terms of whether households purchased assets together, or whether they did so individually and with whom. Here, in terms of the land parcels that pertain to peasant agriculture, you can see that the most common form was really joint ownership by a couple, right? And when it came to individual property, to our surprise, a larger share of parcels were owned individually by women than by men. And a not insignificant share was owned by other combinations, mother and son, or two brothers, or the mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So we took all of that into account. Aggregating by sex, we had an even more surprising result, that women were 54% of the landowners. But here, let me draw your attention that we were looking at land ownership within peasant agriculture. We had made a fairly arbitrary distinction between peasant agriculture and agribusiness, asking in terms of the number of workers that were usually employed. So if a household reported that they employed more than 5 workers or more, they immediately went into the business module, and we considered them an agricultural business. This data was surprising because it also shows that a large number of agricultural businesses are owned by women. Most of these were in the livestock sector, pig farms, chicken farms, quite a few dairy farms, for example. But a lot of sort of urban garden type of activities, where you have intensive urban, semi-urban agriculture, on the peripheries of the cities, being run by women entrepreneurs. And it was also quite curious that these businesses tended not to be family businesses, but women and men would consider them their business. You can see the joint property by the couple is only 7% of those. But once we take into account all these forms of property, we still end up with a fairly egalitarian distribution of businesses by sex. This data was actually shocking in Ecuador when we presented it. People didn't believe it. But there are problems with this data because and it's the difference between doing a household survey and an agricultural census. Focusing on the household as your entry point, you're going to not overrepresent, but a large share, 40% of your households are going to be poor by definition, depending on your poverty lines, of course. So what we've really captured is an incredible number of small farms. But going through the household, you really miss the big landowners, right? Because they're rarely living, on their farms. They're living in gated communities in the urban centers. And as with all household surveys, our survey was truncated in that we never got into those gated communities, right? People just will not be interviewed, and particularly when you say that you're doing an asset survey or wealth survey. So that is a problem. But it's the sampling problem of focusing on households rather than agricultural units, which is what a census does, that gives us, these results of, apparent gender equality. I'm sure that if we had an agricultural census that asked the ownership question, it would be far different from this. So these are some words of caution in terms of thinking about these data. Well, let me turn to the last question in terms of how land is acquired. The family, community, the market, the state. I'm going to begin with the state because it allows me to talk a bit about the changes in women's land rights and how these have been strengthened. I'd like to think about 3 moments of land reform in Latin America. The whole period of the exclusion of women, which is really right up through the 1980s. The 90s, which were the recognition of women's land rights. And then their strengthening after 2000, primarily in the 4 countries of progressive governments that were still doing land reform in Latin America. The first moment, the exclusion of women, goes all the way back to the Mexican Revolution, the first agrarian reform in the hemisphere, through the Bolivian and Cuban agrarian reforms of the 1950s, the Alliance for Progress agrarian reforms, and then the second generation reforms of the 70s and 80s. And if we consider the data that's available, we can only come to one conclusion, that there were very few female beneficiaries of these reforms. However, many countries didn't even collect data on the sex of the beneficiaries. There we have to rely on case studies, such as the case for Chile, Ecuador, and Peru. And what these indicate, both in terms of highlands and the coast, is that women were rarely even 5% of the beneficiaries. For 2 of the early reformers, Mexico and Cuba, we do have data for 2 points in time. You can see for 1970, women were only 1% of the ejidatarias, which was the main collective land holdings that were set up in the Mexican agrarian reform. That increased to 15% by the mid-'80s, primarily through inheritance, because one of the provisions at that time in the agrarian or in the ejido legislation was that the spouse or the partner in a consensual union had the first rights of inheritance, so it should go to the spouse before to someone else. In Cuba, a similar process. In 1979, women were on 5% of the individual owners of the land to the tiller program in Cuba, and that doubled over the next decade, primarily through the inheritance process. If we go to the other countries, you can see that women were at most 11, 12, maybe 13% of the agrarian reform beneficiaries. But they really point to the issue of the exclusion of women from state intervention in land redistribution. Well, I want to tell you a story about how I got involved in this issue. I did my dissertation research in Cajamarca, Peru. The objective of my dissertation was to do a quantitative study of the gender division of labor in agriculture, both in peasant production and in the rural labor market. But when I arrived in Cajamarca, the agrarian reform had just come to the highlands. And as I'm sure has happened to many of you in field work, it's really hard to stay concentrated on what you thought you were going to do in the field when there's something really exciting going on, that you would much rather be studying. So I managed to do both things. I did complete what I set out to do, but I became fascinated by the agrarian reform. And I went to as many of these interventions, as they were called, as possible during my year and a half of field work. So Agrarian Reform Day was the day that the agrarian reform officials would arrive on a farm. In the case of the Cajamarca Valley, these were all capitalist dairy farms, run with wage workers, with fairly modern owners who had been probably the sons of hacienda owners, but these had been broken down into relatively modern farms. And on Agrarian Reform Day, what happened was that the land and the dairy cattle were split up between what the owner would keep as their reserve. Under the agrarian reform law for the highlands, they could keep up to 30% of the land as well as the capital investment. So here we have the men that were the wage workers dividing up the cattle. Well, the interesting thing about the cattle farm or the dairy farms is that about 30%, 25 to 30% of the labor force was female. The dairy maids that were the ones that did the milking, every morning and every afternoon. And even though this isn't the best photo in the world, I wanted to show it because you can see way over there on your left that the women who are the dairy maids are all sitting down, sort of watching what's going on, right, as the men divide up their cows, because they have a one-to-one relationship with every single one of these cows, who also have names, and they call them by their names. And I think this photo captures quite well the process of marginalization, really, that took place in that Peruvian agrarian reform. Women in the Cajamarca area that I studied on the dairy farms ended up being only 2% of the cooperative members, with 98% being the men. So what happened? I later conceptualized this in terms of 4 mechanisms of exclusion of women. The first was legal factors. The way the agrarian reform was conceptualized and written, only one person per household, the household head, could be the beneficiary. So if you were a wife or a son or daughter and you didn't have your own children, you were basically excluded by the beneficiary criteria. Second were structural factors. In many countries, the agrarian reform really couldn't accommodate both permanent workers and temporary workers. So the priority tended to go to the permanent labor force. So this is partly what excluded women in the case of Cajamarca, because for the few women that were heads of household, they were also considered temporary workers because they only worked 4 hours a day and not full time, because of the gender or the occupational segregation that we had within that labor market. Another factor was ideological, in the sense that agriculture was conceived as a male occupation. Women were the helpers. So why should the agrarian reform benefit them? And then we have institutional factors that at that point in time, if you looked at the personnel of the agricultural ministries, those that were doing the agrarian reform, even the leadership of the peasant organizations, this was all male. We didn't have any consideration of gender issues in that point in time in the 70s. Well, what changed? Let me get to the second moment that coincides with the neoliberal counter-reforms of the 1990s, right? I say coincides because it wasn't because of neoliberalism that we get the recognition of women's land rights. Rather, there was been a number of building blocks that had been laid in place over the 70s and 80s, starting with the development of the field of women in development or gender in development. Certainly the expansion of the international women's movement, the international feminist movement. In both of these, the UN conferences on women played a really important role in spurring attention to these factors. And one of the most important preconditions for the changes that came was CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This was ratified soon after by the majority of Latin American countries. And the importance of CEDAW is that it required constitutional change and the reform of civil codes. So as a result of CEDAW, when neoliberal governments started reforming their agrarian codes, they had to make those consistent with the constitutional principle of gender equality, right? Which they could do in a number of forms. The more neoliberal countries ended their agrarian reforms, and in their new codes, happily, they got rid of head of households as being the beneficiaries, and now they focused on natural or juridic persons. The juridic persons is that once again, you can have agribusiness owning land, right, and being a beneficiary of state programs. So this was sort of a double-edged sword. You got rid of the head of household, which made the legislation gender neutral, right, which was going to be an important change. But you also affected the potential for redistribution of lands. On the other hand, you have a group of countries, shown in the other part of the slide, where gender equality and men's and women's land rights were written right into the new agrarian legislation. Nicaragua there is sort of an outlier because this was not part of a neoliberal but government under the Sandinista. If we have time, if anyone's interested, I'll tell you the story of why Nicaragua led the pack. But basically what happened once we had gender equality in the land legislation is that mechanisms of inclusion of women had to follow. And the two main mechanisms of inclusion that we then see different countries adopting was the joint adjudication or titling of land to couples and priority to female household heads. Each of these had sort of different implications. In most countries of South America, you have communal property. So any assets acquired in the marriage belong jointly to the two. So in those countries, joint adjudication or titling wasn't really so radical. It was basically just making sure that your agrarian law conformed to the civil code of your marital regime. But for some countries where the marital regime is separation of property, that is, whatever the man or the woman brings to marriage, acquires during the marriage, remains their own, and there's no joint property that's accumulated in the marriage, their joint adjudication and titling is really much more radical, right? And to be effective, joint titling or joint adjudication just can't be voluntary. It really needs to be mandatory to make sure that it happens. Priorities to female household heads we can think of as an affirmative action measure, basically making up for the discrimination against female household heads in the past that I illustrated for you. Other mechanisms meant focusing on women that were vulnerable due to particular situations, due to the violence in Colombia or being in a consensual union in Costa Rica, priority to widows in inheritance of agrarian reform land in the case of Honduras. One of the more interesting changes was the case of the PPT program in El Salvador, which was the land redistribution program to the former guerrilleros during the peace process after they laid down arms. Women were about a third of the insurgents in El Salvador. There was a number of women comandantes, and their main demand was that we want land individually. We don't want land with our partners. Forget joint adjudication. And they carried this to the extreme that the new housing that was built in these settlements, it was basically like a duplex for a couple, where one half belonged to the man and the other half to the woman. And the same thing for the land plots that were handed out. I've never been back to see what happened, but it'd be a great research project for someone to see the results of that. Well, other initiatives were setting quotas in terms of women's access to land, such as in Brazil. In terms of outcomes, the darn thing about the 90s is that not many countries were redistributing land in this period. So we got finally a change in legislation that's gender progressive. But the main initiatives were land titling projects or, in a few countries, market-assisted land reforms. Just to show you some of the results, Colombia, that did the market-assisted land reform, did institute joint titling. We get women as 45% of the beneficiaries. Nicaragua did joint titling with the lands of former agrarian reform beneficiaries, primarily the cooperatives when these were broken up, and they were about a third. The results here were much more beneficial than in Mexico, where in their land titling process, after the reform of Article 27 in the Mexican Constitution, land titles only went to one person per household, the ejidatario. So that same old problem is integrated into this new phase. So the women, when there were around 21% of the ejidatarias, and ended up representing about that share of those that got individual land titles. Let me go quickly through the third moment, what I call the strengthening of women's land rights, which is related to the 21st century reforms of progressive governments. Evo Morales in Bolivia, Lula in Brazil, Correa in Ecuador, and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. What's common to these four experiences of the 21st century agrarian reforms is that these governments all came to power committed to redistributive and integral agrarian reforms. That is, they came to power saying that they were going to expropriate land and they were going to redistribute it to the landless or those with insufficient land. And besides a land distribution program, they were going to provide all of the services so that you had a real comprehensive agrarian reform and not just the land reforms of the past. The other commonality is that they came to power strongly supported by the rural social movements particularly those aligned with Clark and La Via Campesina, who have been the main champions of agrarian reform and food sovereignty in the current period. Also, all of them strengthen women's formal land rights. And the main way they did this was first by putting women's land rights into their constitutions. So they wrote in gender equality and land rights, and then most of them followed it up with good language in their agrarian laws that included these different mechanisms of inclusion. Bolivia, mandatory joint titling. Brazil did both, joint titling and priority to female household heads. Ecuador and Venezuela, priority to female household heads. Well, I'm just going to quickly run through some of this data. Bolivia did carry through on joint titling. Consider here for the total, by the end of the titling of individual parcels, 81% were titled jointly to a couple. However, Bolivia didn't do much in terms of land redistribution. Some authors argue that they did a good job of redistributing land rights within the household because in many ways they broke with their civil codes, and even though men may have inherited a land parcel, when it came to titling, it was titled in the name of both the man and the woman. So it really represented a redistribution of land rights within the household. But that was land that the household already had access to. It wasn't new land. And as you can see here, what was actually redistributed as new land primarily went to TCOs, which were a communal form of land organization, or other communal groups in the Amazon region of the country. So overall, not much land was redistributed. Brazil also, through joint adjudication in the first Lula government, we get a significant increase in the share of women beneficiaries through joint titling. Later on, at the end of Lula's term, it was almost all female heads that were being given new lands on the asentamientos that were being created. So they also followed through. And in the case of Brazil, the redistribution was much more significant than in the other countries. Ecuador, they did carry out their commitment that women should make up 30% of the peasant groups that received land. Here you can see it under land redistribution. But look at the number of families that were benefited, 11,000. So basically, there was no land redistribution to speak of. The most important initiative was in terms of land titling. And even though my graduate school colleague was the Minister of Agriculture, we weren't able to set up the data system to collect data on the sex of the beneficiaries. What did change over this period is that the land titles now have 2 spaces. So they do encourage the names of 2 people, the husband and wife, to be put on the land title. But we can't follow it in terms of the data. Venezuela, we really don't know what's going on. Lots of land was expropriated or regularized, but there's sparse data on beneficiaries, nothing by sex. It really seems that whatever gender initiatives there were initially came from the urban women's movement. Because you had weak rural social movements, there was really no organizing of rural women behind the agrarian reform. So to sum up, all of these reforms did make concerted efforts to regularize land tenancy. to identify idle and illegally occupied national lands along with their titling. But the only one where there was significant redistribution was Brazil. In approximately 500,000 households were settled on 20 million hectares of land in the assentamentos. But that fell far short of the demand for land. And while all strengthened women's formal land rights, there was significant redistribution only in Brazil because it was part of this larger process. Although in Bolivia, the joint titling of land, we would argue, did strengthen women's security of tenure. What explains the different gender outcomes? Well, if we look at all of these points, you see that Brazil and Bolivia are very similar in many respects. The rural social movements were either a part of the state, as in the case of the MAS in Bolivia, or strongly aligned, as in the case of Brazil. In both those countries, Brazil and Bolivia, you had strong rural women's organizations, as well as strong women's collectives within the mixed-sex organizations. So both were very important on land rights becoming an issue for the mixed rural social movements themselves. They were also assisted by gender mechanisms within the state. These offices really do matter. When you don't have them, as in the case of Ecuador and Venezuela, not much happens. You've got to have those mediators on the part of the state for good or formal land rights to, in fact, become a reality. At the same time, the extent of redistribution of land to women is limited by the scope and the depth of the reforms. And that really limits the extent to which they can be truly redistributive. That's very much related to the role of agribusiness and the reliance on agro exports in each of these countries, which I don't have time to go into, but what we see in Latin America is that land appears as concentrated as ever. This is just looking at the percent of land surface under the control of the largest 1% of farms. Well, I wanted to go into other ways of acquiring ownership of land. I see my time is out, although I didn't see anybody waving something at me, but I can tell because I'm getting hoarse that we need to move on. Let me just try to put the land reforms in perspective by showing you this data on how land is acquired based on the two surveys for Honduras and Nicaragua that we considered earlier. The agrarian reform share is in gray. You can see in Honduras, that it was just a blip, really. And in Nicaragua, that does go under the group that carried out more significant agrarian reforms. Still it represents 10% or less of land being acquired. So in the broader perspective, it really is either the family and inheritance or the market, that really determine or that are really the key moments in terms of women being able to acquire land. I'm going to quickly go to the conclusion. Where here I'm going back now to intuition. What I draw out of all of this data is that I do think that in most countries we're seeing this process of feminization of smallholder production. I think that it may be associated with women's increased ownership of small plots either through inheritance or through the market. What we're seeing in terms of case studies on inheritance of land is that there's a number of factors that are making inheritance more gender neutral. Basically because young people don't want to stay on the farm. So whoever is willing to stay on the farm, take care of the parents in the old age, be it son or daughter, right, tends to be able to inherit the farm, usually compensating the other siblings in some other way, because most Latin American countries do have equal inheritance among all children. I think another factor that's really supporting the feminization of agriculture is all of the attention going to agroecology, also linked to food sovereignty and the different initiatives around women's empowerment. In some countries, of course, more than others. My recent experience has been in Ecuador, where agroecology is really, really big. Right? And the great majority of participants in these programs are rural women, not in all cases being landowners, but increasingly the ones that are in charge of the land, be it their own or their husbands or that of both of them. In terms of land ownership in the data, the other thing I want to stress is how we're still hampered by the lack of consistent data on the gender distribution of land ownership. But in most countries, yes, it's still very, very unequal. And that's related to the overall distribution of land ownership in the region. While we don't have the data to assess it precisely, the distribution of land remains quite unequal. But being always the optimist, wanting to end on a positive note, there is some progress on the data gender front, and one is the SDGs. The fact that we finally have an indicator 5.A1 in support of SDG 5, countries are now being encouraged to collect data on the share of women among landowners or with secure rights to land. The problem is that word encouraged, because all of these indicators are just suggested indicators. There's no enforcement, it's not mandatory, and there's no financing. So whether countries will do it or not, is really up to the goodwill of governments. The other positive note is that in the instructions and manuals for the next round of agricultural censuses, 2020, now joint holders are being included just as the standardized feature. So hopefully in that next round, we will have a more realistic definition of who the farmers are. In addition, there's finally a suggested additional module, Module 10, on the intra-household distribution of management and resources. Thus, for the very first time, if countries adopt this module as an add-on to the census, we might get data on the or disaggregated data on the ownership of land. But of course, we need a major lobbying effort to ensure compliance. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Microphones here. Any questions? Yes. All right.
So thank you very much. This was great. I wanted to ask you about what you ended on, which was the question of the data and the encouragement.
Yeah.
But there is also a provision in the SDGs of encouraging, I suppose, richer countries to assist poorer countries in the data management effort. It's not entirely left to the poor countries because it's a big burden. And so is there appropriate lobbying, I suppose, to use your words, in that direction? Because it's quite difficult for lower income countries to really come through. So I was curious.
Do you think the Trump administration's interested in the 53 gender indicators? You know, but yeah, you know, the Washington lobby of sort of feminist gender and development NGOs, I mean, they're out there, you know, and they're the ones that are leading this effort. I think the international organizations have been doing a terrific job. You know, the World Bank, the UN Statistical Institute, UN Women, they've really taken this very seriously, the land issue more than anything, and they've piloted a number of different ways to approach this. They're doing a lot of training sessions around the world. So I'm hopeful that we're going to finally get some of those improvements, but probably not in Latin America. You know, most of this is still oriented towards Africa and Asia. You know, in Latin America, you have a few countries that are solidly, you know, behind these kinds of efforts. You know, Mexico, INEGI has been really important, but they weren't able to do a census. They were supposed to do an agricultural census in 2017, and it was canceled for lack of financing. I know that they had planned on doing the joint holders, not the ownership data. So those are real constraints. Yeah. He's great.
Thanks. That was great. And I would say, by the way, that most statistical agencies in Latin America don't need a lot of help from richer countries. They're very competent. The question is whether they're willing to do the right thing, right? I mean, it's a whole different kettle of fish compared with the ones that are getting help today. Okay, so and from that point of view, on that census, I'm sure you know there's a 50 by 2030 project focused between FAO, the World Bank, and EFAD to do both agricultural censuses and household surveys in rural areas, 50 of them by 2030 in primarily low-income countries. And so I guess I would highlight there's an opportunity to lobby there. But my real question is, I have worked mostly on Africa, so my experience is the feminization of agriculture in Africa has to do with the fact that, in general, when off-farm work becomes available in rural areas, men are the first ones to seize it. Because it tends to be higher earning, and also, and so they take it, which is one reason why feminization of agriculture tends to occur. At the same time, women will find it easier to co-produce non-market and market work by doing the farming, and so farming sometimes fits men in that they will help with the harvest, which allows them to then appropriate the income, of course. So you didn't sort of mention that idea of why farming is becoming feminized in Latin America, and I'm wondering to what extent that is a factor in Latin America.
Yeah, you know, the other part of feminization is looking what's going on in the agricultural labor markets. And that's another paper. I didn't put it in the stock. But there what we've seen is with the growth of non-traditional exports that are particularly labor intensive, all the fruits and vegetables, that you're getting, you know, almost half of the field labor is female for many of these crops. You know, from asparagus to cauliflower to broccoli, the cut flour industry throughout Latin America. That's sort of the first industry that's employing women as permanent workers on a full-time basis. So there is a big change going on there. But it's also really hard to capture through the different employment surveys. So, yeah. And part of it is because of the seasonal nature. The usual thing that you do a survey saying, what did you do for the last 2 weeks? It happened that you didn't work the last 2 weeks because it was off season, and you didn't do the survey. Well, many countries are trying to do these more often, but not always in rural areas. So, there's problems there. Yeah, rural women's participation rate is also increasing, which captures both their agricultural and non.
Or in peasant farming.
Well, altogether, yeah. If you look at that change, but it hasn't been as fast as the increases in urban women's participation rates. Which I think is because still of the undernumeration issues. We've made great progress, but we haven't solved all the problems of measuring women's work.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was interesting. I think I'm following up a little bit on the same question, but I'm looking at this data, and besides being curious about inherently what the patterns are, I'm sort of drawing the conclusion that we should care because it is a sort of indicator for the agency and well-being of women. Yeah. But so how would you, given the consideration of shift from preferable labor off farm and the sort of changes that are going on now, why is this important? Why do you believe that this is something that we should care about? And what does it mean for women really in terms of their well-being?
Okay, it's in terms of the feminization of peasant agricultural production, it's super important if peasant farming is still providing an important share of the foodstuffs within a country, right? Because if you're ignoring 20 to 30% of your farmers because they're women, so you're not directing extension services to them, you're not doing the training, you're not giving the marketing assistance, access to credit, et cetera, then you have a real problem. And particularly for those governments that profess to be doing food sovereignty, right? Not all governments are into that, right? With neoliberal, we have markets, comparative advantage, a lot of other stuff going on. Peasant agriculture on the whole seems to be in decline in the region. But then we have this whole agroecology movement coming in, that's making fresh food, green initiatives really important. And women are the ones grabbing onto them. So you've got to pay attention to who the farmers are to direct the appropriate programs. And if we looked at the data, if you look just at the census data on whether it's access to technical assistance, credit, modern inputs, irrigation, there's just a huge gender bias. It's even worse than in the case of the distribution of land in some countries. So there's a real problem there. It's usually stated in the case of Africa, that's sort of more visible, that ignoring women farmers, you're just digging your own grave, in terms of rural development. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm getting the gooey eyeball from the police security, but I think I have time for one more question from my favorite alum, Peter Meyer. Can I squeeze by there?
I'm a loudmouth, so I won't use the mic. But I wasn't going to ask this question until I saw the cartoon at the end, which yeah. I know that the data is rough over time and across the region, but are there governmental structures, not just programs, that tend to lead to more feminization of agriculture? Is it the strength of the church or a leftist regime or U.S. intervention or things like that have negative or positive impacts on that? Or is the data just not there yet?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples. I think that the most positive interventions that are going on right now are those of NGOs around agroecology. Those are the principal ones that I see that are really being directed to women farmers right across the region. But if you look at the rural social movements, and this is what this poster was intended to capture, is that rural women everywhere have really woken up in terms of land rights, and they're claiming their land rights. So in all of the, whenever you have one of the meetings of CLOC is the Latin American Coordinator of Rural Organizations, which is like the main network of peasant rural worker organizations in Latin America. They always do a women's conference for a couple days before the main conference, and all of these groups have just really now internalized the woman and land issue is a primary issue. So it's not going away. Women are demanding equity, and rural women are speaking out on their own in a way that was really unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. So we are at a new stage, and things will probably have to be, if they're going to be shaken up, they're going to be shaken up from below by these kinds of demands, I think, rather than from the top down, as it was many times in the past. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, on that happy note, join me in thanking Professor Deere.
Thank you.